Thanks for coming. My name is Jake. I am MD of something called Media Bounty, a B Corp ad agency, plus co-founder of the Conscious Advertising Network, work with Flow on ACT Climate Labs, and then also Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, so a few things. I'll let the panel introduce themselves first, sure. But Flo first.
Yeah, great. Thank you all for coming. My name is Florencia. I am the strategy director of ACT Climate Labs. I am a strategist specialized in mostly creative communications, advertising, insights, and more. And I have conducted a piece of research on an audience that we call the persuadables, which is something that I'm going to be talking about today. And that's me.
Seb. Hi everybody, I'm Sebastian Munden, everyone calls me Seb, and I'm the global chair of AdNet Zero. We're here to get the advertising industry to lean into behavior change and help to accelerate the more sustainable economy through scale communication and behavior change. I'm also the chair of WRAP, the Waste and Resources Action Programme, and between these two things they keep me very busy.
Thanks. So the title of this is Hero or Villain. Be interesting to see where everybody sits on that before, after, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. Advertising is anywhere between $750 billion to $1 trillion a year. So this is a massive influence industry. It changes behavior. It does some good things, but it also, somebody recently said on stage that it can roll a turd in glitter and make it look good. We have sponsors here, for example, that also use advertising to convince us that our current lifestyles and our future lifestyles are one of, desire. We are the architects of desire. But it can also, the power of advertising, the scale of advertising, can, if put to good use, actually change behavior and drive better behavior and hold the bad actors to account. So let's deal with the negative first. I wanted to ask, are we the baddies? How does advertising have to get its house in order? Seb.
So I think one of the advantages for companies that make physical things is they got much quicker into the thought about the supply chain traceability and understanding where stuff's come from and where it needs to go to. My experience of working with the advertising industry is that that kind of awareness was has been very low until quite recently. That thought about what happens in a non-physical supply chain. And so I think in that sense, particularly advertising agencies have been relatively slower to thinking about the sustainability of their supply chain than many of their clients. So I think that's definitely been a problem. I think there's still relatively low awareness, and that needs to be corrected. I think also they haven't totally understood the advantage of putting those kind of techniques in service of a more sustainable economy. And I think that's the big change. You start to see people within the ad industry thinking we really need to put these powers to good use. And I think that's creating a change in the industry, both bottom up and top down. So I do see that change. It's still too slow.
Yeah. And one of the kind of issues, or lots of issues across the advertising industry is, often accused of greenwashing, for example. We'll touch on that in a little bit of time, but also the kind of emerging tsunami of climate mis and disinformation that we are facing and seeing across media channels, across tech platforms, and what is advertising's role within that. Can you talk a little bit more about what you see from your research and the work you do with that climate?
Yeah, sure. I think, first of all, it would be good to know how many people work in companies here or how many people work in government, or if a show of hands, just to kind of like, okay.
So businesses?
Businesses, great. Government, NGOs, Okay, just to kind of because climate misinformation is a huge topic that can be also a little bit niche, so I just want to frame it in the right way. Basically, what we see is that in this narrative that we tell people about all of the changes that we need to make in order to adapt and fight climate change, there is this issue of misinformation around climate that is actually impacting and influencing the way that people think about things. If you go about your day and you consume, specific newspapers, you're probably going to be exposed to specific narratives around climate change that might not be particularly true. But the more that you get exposed to them, the more you start thinking about them in the way that they influence the way that you think about specific climate issues. And misinformation is not always kind of like, just sharing something on Twitter and kind of like doing it without any intended, an intention to misinform. There's a big business behind misinformation. There's a lot of bad actors who are actually, investing a lot of money on misinforming people. And they do that because they want people to think about climate change in a negative way. And so misinformation is really our main competitor when it comes to increasing the level of support that there is for climate issues. The more that we see, the more that we see people vote against issues or policies that are in the favor of climate. And so we have identified this really big audience that we call the persuadables, who are kind of like the big majority, the silent majority that we like to call them, who are by no means climate activists, but they are also by no means climate deniers. They believe that climate change is happening, but they are not too sure what to think about it, or like what things align with their values, or what things they want to get on board with or support. And so we think that climate misinformation is actually making these audiences very vulnerable to being influenced in the wrong way, and making them influenced in a way that whenever a climate policy gets put forward, they will reject it, or they will showcase that, get involved in a way that doesn't allow us to really make the most of the transition that we need to make. So climate misinformation is really an issue that we focus on, that we think is under-researched and under kind of, basically one that we think is very important to keep an eye on, because its impact can be really big.
We've got some polling coming out very soon. We did some polling a couple of years ago, launched it at COP alongside the United Nations in the impacts of public perception of this climate misinformation. And just one stat 2 years ago was that 25% of Brits thought that we could not afford to get to net zero by 2050. So a quarter of the population, late 2022. We're going to be releasing an update of that polling in the next few weeks. That figure, and obviously there's margins for error, but that figure has grown from 25% to 40%. So 40% now this country think that we cannot afford to reach net zero by 2050. Interesting research coming out of the Potsdam Institute says that climate change is going to cost us 38 trillion a year by 2050. So this kind of mismatch of understanding of the impact and the cost of climate misinformation. Everybody's talking about the cost of net zero, and omitting that key stat, and omission is a critical point about how much not doing anything would cost.
In a way, Jake, that's why we kind of set up Ad Net Zero, which was to, educate the advertising world to try and get them to lean in to addressing these issues, to create a framework that focused both on, changing the way the industry works, so decarbonising itself, and I think quite a lot of the, the kind of digital media is probably about 3% of global emissions, so it's not as big as food or energy, but it's still quite considerable. But also, more importantly, changing the work that was being made to address these issues. Ad Net Zero has been going about 3 years now. We have a lot of signatories, particularly amongst media owners in this country and in the electronic advertising supply chain in the US, but also increasingly now the advertising agencies, and really trying to show how the agencies and the industry as a whole could mobilize and be a real force for good in driving the more sustainable economy.
Absolutely. One thing we do have to kind of deal with, we're going to move on to the positive role of how advertising can actually change stuff, but we have to deal with then, you know, some of the elephants in the room around greenwashing, for example. So obviously the industry is getting a bad rap for greenwashing. I have to say that the ASA is doing a very good job in picking up ads and identifying ads that are either omitting cherry-picking information, for example. But there is very little transparency across the industry and very little disclosure about agency work with high carbon industries and fossil fuel companies. And even, I know that it's been called out a number of times here, but obviously one of the main sponsors here is BP, which is rolling back its commitment to dropping carbon for net zero. Aramco Ventures is also a sponsor here. So just a couple of figures on that. Aramco Ventures profit last year, 121 billion. Shareholder dividend, 97 billion. Aramco Ventures, 7 billion. So the small part of the net zero transition, you know, is being outweighed. So this question of a lack of transparency, should they be able to create that social license by sponsoring events like this, has to be questioned, and you have to have transparency. Fine if it's underneath, you know, this organization is not aligned to a net zero pathway or to Paris, but we have to have transparency through the whole supply chain if we're going to improve the supply chain. A lot of people in advertising saying you have to treasure what you measure and kind of measure everything. We're very good at measuring success, but sometimes hide the stuff that we're in the sort of the elephant in the room. Moving on to some of the more positive stuff. So, Seb, in the book that you recently wrote with Matt Bourne, we're also talking about there that advertising has got us into this position, but you often talk about, well, actually, one of the funny things about advertising is it could actually get us out of this or play a big role in getting us out of that. You talk about, supporting a better future. How? What's advertisers' role in the future?
Well, one of the things that we see, the collision of my two worlds in a way, which is in the world of rap, talking to, companies who are thinking about the scale of the behavior change required of the citizens or customers or whatever, and just, despairing of how long it might take to help people make different choices. And on the other hand, we see how quickly sometimes when advertising captures a mood, attention, it can reframe choices, make them more understandable, more desirable. And so actually one of the things we're doing is trying to connect these people up and say, look, we can use these tools and the power of advertising to actually accelerate good behavior, to explain and put forward the virtues of more sustainable products and services. And actually, I think a lot of people in the industry want to do that. And so I think it could be one of the very few occasions of what got us here might get us out of here, because actually there's no reason why the devil should have all the best tunes. And therefore, there is the sort of discussion that we had in the previous session with David Halpin, and that whole kind of behavioral science plus communication could really reframe a lot of these choices. A world of better choices rather than more choices, a world of high desirability rather than a world of rationing or deprivation. And I think advertising is one of the few kind of legal forms of expressing those thoughts in a emotionally kind of acceptable and enticing way. So I think our cry to advertising industry is sign up for the Sustainable Advertising Manifesto, be a force for good, understand and get on top of greenwashing, understand how to do proper green claims with proper third-party verification, and work with clients who have better products and services to fight the good fight and win market share and be effective. I suppose our mantra is, make the big brands better and the better brands bigger.
I think with exactly that, one of the things that the climate sector has done for a very long time is advertise to itself and only preach to the converted. And obviously, Flo, the work that you've done within the Persuadables is, yes, talking to the climate sector, but also talking to business to say, how can we actually drive down category emissions in sectors, but by reaching people where they are and actually on the ground. So you've traveled around the UK, sitting in people's living rooms, I know,
Yes.
kind of listening to feedback of what actually not Innovation Zero thinks about this issue, but actually real people out in the wider country.
Yeah, for sure. I think getting that perspective from outside of the climate sector, and as I mentioned, of this big majority of the population is very important. So right now we estimate that Persuadables represent 69% of the UK population. That is a huge portion of society that really we can get on board if we reach them with the right messages and the right information and the right narratives. And I think, as I mentioned before, if climate misinformation is such a big issue, but it needs to be countered by positive narratives that really showcase that the transition can be good, can be better for their families, better for their jobs, and that is why also advertising needs to play a role in actually showcasing that transition to as many people as we possibly can. Because we really need to convince them to be on board with this. A lot of people, and what I've heard in many of the interviews that I've had, it's just that people are not really up for change. People are really scared about change. They also feel like they have been let down quite a lot. There is really a myriad of perspectives on why things aren't working for regular people today. And Persuadables are just a key audience that we need to engage in that front. So we have produced 2 reports on Persuadables. There is our 2022 report and research in our 2023, and I have been in Scotland, in Aberdeen. I was actually in Aberdeen during the biggest offshore conference that is in Europe that is held in Aberdeen, and it was really interesting to see the perspectives of people who have a very close relationship with the oil and gas industry and what they think that the transition can look like. I was also doing this research in Newcastle, Nottingham, Birmingham, in Pembrokeshire in Wales, and also in London. So we have a ton of different perspectives and very actionable insights that also companies can, and organizations, NGOs, and government can take on board. So if you're interested in learning more about Persuadables, please do reach out after this, because we have a lot to share.
On the sharing, there was a brilliant point made earlier by, I think it was Breakthrough Climate Science, who were saying we can make all this stuff, but actually getting it seen is also a critical part of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And relying on friendly journalists. There are a lot of hostile journalists in this country to climate action and to the transition that's needed. So actually getting beyond that and using advertising to be able to tell these stories. How can sort of the industry, businesses, NGOs, philanthropy, how can we tell those sort of authentic sustainable stories to different people with those different perspectives that you kind of saw?
Yeah, I think there is this really helpful framework called the EAST framework. So it's EAST. The E stands for easy, so making the transition as easy as possible, and kind of making it available as well. The A stands for attractive, because we have to sell this as something that people want. And so making the switch to or the transition attractive to people is very important to get them on board. The S means social. We are social people who we behave in the same way that others behave, and sometimes standing out and being the odd one out isn't really something that we want to do. So making it socially acceptable to engage in, more sustainable behaviors also is so important to get more people on board. And finally, the T stands for timely. So making it so that when people are faced with the opportunity to make a decision that will be, a more green decision or a more sustainable decision, they can do so. And so I think that is kind of like a good framework to also think about how our campaigns are optimized for that East framework, and how can we put different triggers to create that opinion shift, but also the behavioral shift that we need.
Same question to Seb. How can we tell these authentic stories, and what are the stories that we need to be telling?
Yeah. So AdNet Zero, with Campaign Magazine, which is the in-house sort of newsletter of the advertising industry, we run the Campaign AdNet Zero Awards, looking every year for these kind of examples. So we're now just starting our third year. In the first year, the winner of the Grand Prix was Hellmann's Mayonnaise, running a really, really clever campaign, not just in this country, but in many countries across the world, encouraging the use of leftovers and the idea of fridge night, the night that you open the fridge, take everything out, and make something delicious out of it with Hellmann's Mayonnaise. And it was amazingly impactful. In this country, that was combined with some content made with Channel 4 around Pruleith and Dr. Rupee, showing families how they could literally save thousands of pounds a year in avoided food waste. And I think that's a good example of a brand shamelessly selling itself as the nicest thing to do with leftovers, but at the same time making a real dent on the kind of behaviours around food waste, which is lingering stuff in the fridge and not using it up. I think that's a really good example. Last year, one of the Grand Prix winners was just such the simplest idea. It was a sticker that you put on fruit from the supermarket in Colombia, and the sticker had a bunch of different colours in a circle, and at each colour it sort of said, this is the time to eat it raw, this is the time to mash it up, this is the time to put it in a smoothie. Just sort of helping people be able to, as it were, deal with fruit at different colours, and not just bin it the moment it didn't look yellow or shiny. Another winner was ITV Love Island's partnership with eBay, which I think has done a lot to transform the sort of, Love Island basically became associated with fast fashion, and ITV, to their credit, realised that this wasn't an association that they wanted to continue, and partnered with eBay, and really started to drive pre-loved clothes both through the wardrobe of the show. And that really made a great difference in terms of, at eBay, the kind of amount of people selling clothes as a result went up, and that, of course, meant more were bought. So really tackling fast fashion. So these, I think, are good examples that we talk about in the book, and there are many more, where actually companies can serve their interests, they can advertise their products, but at the same time do amazing things for reframing big social issues, big climate issues. And so I suppose if I could wave a magic wand, I'd want all the people with sustainable startups and sustainable products actually to get together with the people in advertising and in behaviour change to really accelerate that difference. Because these are two groups of people who don't ordinarily come together, and by force of serendipity I find myself in both worlds, just wishing that they'd get along a bit and do more good stuff together.
Do you know what? I think that's a really interesting point. Like the work we do with the Conscious Advertising Network, we put together the likes of Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and activist groups, but also big advertiser groups, the WPPs of the world, effectively in the same meeting with the big platforms. And the best compliment that we got from the platforms is we could not tell who were the activists, who were the climate scientists, and who were the brands, because you were all asking for the same thing. So like joining that big tent up in terms of mutual learning authentically, because obviously one of the massive things about this is avoiding that inauthenticity and that greenwash that we discussed earlier. It has to be authentic, it has to be aligned with driving down emissions according to, or restoring nature, or whatever it may be, according to the SDGs, for example, has to be authentic, and then people can work together from there. I think that's one of the biggest things about this whole industry is advertisers have sat in a bit of an old ivory tower selling possibly more stuff that, well, no, not even possibly, selling more stuff to people that they don't need, and NGOs have been over here, and actually that coming together in order to change that narrative is the most important step that we need to make.
And that's why I think it's really important that the advertising industry works on its own emissions, even if they're only 3%, because it's going through what everyone else is going through to think about decarbonisation and better use of energy, etc.
I think I've not thought about it like that, because I've described it slightly as rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic if you don't take action 5. But I do think that getting into the behaviour of going through what everybody else is going through is a really good point. So we're talking about behaviour change here, and I know that we're running out of time. I was going to say, like, what's the 1 or 2 things that you think, are the sort of killer insights? What do you want the audience to take away with? If we've got time, we'll take some questions as well, but we might be shut up by the moderators and everybody might want to go home. But yeah, what's the kind of one thing that you would like to see?
I would say reviewing your current communications plans and strategies to make sure that you are leading with hope over fear, that you're leading with stories over stats, and that you are showcasing the solution rather than the sacrifice.
Great.
Yeah, I agree with Flo. I think the important thing is if you've got a startup or you're thinking as a part of government about behaviour change, don't be afraid to come to advertising. I think there are people in the industry who want to help. I think it's an existential moment for advertising, which is, this is kind of like redeem or die, because I think it will get regulated sort of more and more if it doesn't lean in.
I completely agree, and that kind of leads us on to the end of the panel. I mean, we talked very early about, is advertising a hero or a villain? Can it be both? Probably, a bit of both, bit of neither, somewhere in the middle. But I do agree that it is an existential moment for the advertising industry to actively choose whether or not it's going to further the interests of high carbon organizations that are not aligned to Paris, or whether it's going to choose to genuinely try and change behavior and drive down
possibility to be the unlikely hero.
The unlikely hero, there you go. Wouldn't that be refreshing? Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
If we do have any questions, do we have any time for any questions or not? 1 or 2, yeah, okay. Yes, in the audience there, Paul Ram.
Do you need the mic? I think they're trying to record it, so you might help them.
That was loud.
Told you I'll shout loudly. Sorry, everybody. I love to hear this, and I especially love to hear this coming from yourself, Seb, because I think Ad Net Zero's not gone far enough, but what I'm hearing from you is moving it far enough. Your point about going through the living experience of decarbonising, advertising's own footprint, I think is interesting. How does advertising go through that exercise from its own legacy brainprint? Since the 1920s, we've been building aspirational lifestyles that have embedded unsustainable behaviours in our culture as cultural norms. We can't turn them off in one go just by putting out some campaigns around Hellmann's mayonnaise. We have to become alert to those cultural norms we've embedded. So how do we actually, as an industry, become alert to that, take responsibility for our complicity in that, and make a change?
I think that's a great point, and Rome isn't built in a day, and it's been sort of, depending on whether you start at 1900 or 1955, advertising's had several decades to build. What I do think is interesting though is how quickly perceptions can change. And I think Pre-Loved Clothes is a brilliant example of, when I was a student, Pre-Loved Clothes, basically, you went to the charity shop because you had to, because you couldn't afford not to, and it became synonymous. Nowadays, when I talk to people, under the age of 30, talk to my 20-something kids, it's about uniqueness, it's about identity, it's about story. So in a period of, let's call it 30 years, I think that attitude has been reframed. So I think there's hope. And I do think it's amazing how quickly it goes when cultural icons, get involved in advertising and changing the message.
Can I just also say on that note, I think that advertising is going, Seb mentioned it, I think advertising, whether it likes it or not, is going to be forced into a reckoning. So there is a whole host, a raft of legislation coming mainly from the EU, the Green Claims Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. The US are in the FTC. You know, we've been giving advice to all of these people. The FTC are changing their green claims as well. So advertising is coming to a reckoning, I think, and it will, the fines, for example, money talks, right? This conference is very much about who's in the room and who's the money. There's banks, there's fossil fuel companies, there's a lot. If boards of companies are starting to talk about material risk of climate and also misleading claims and greenwashing, and if they don't get that right, they're going to get fined 4% of global turnover, that's going to force them to do that anyway. So I think there's many people within the advertising industry now that are facing that reckoning. We all talk about, like, once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and a lot of people are taking their heads out of the sand. So I think that, you know, it'll come kicking or not kicking or screaming by both regulation and people doing the right thing.
It should be
Plus,
part of the service, shouldn't it?
It should be part of the service, but
to
also
keep you within, as an advertiser, keep you
Yes.
within the claims best practice.
But to finish on that hope point, you know, there was a piece of research done by the CBI and ECIU. The net zero economy is growing by 9% in this country, compared to flatlining across the wider economy. So the opportunity is there as well for advertising and everybody to get involved in that if it's authentic and if it's done, you know, based in the facts.
Very good.
We need to finish, but one question. Promise for 1 minute.
Yeah.
No more, including question and answer. And before we continue, I encourage everybody to join the conversation. All the questions, all the remarks from this session will be saved and given them to the speakers to be able to respond.
Brilliant.
Great.
Thank you.
So don't worry if you haven't done your questioning or asking or you have not communicated enough.
Thank you.
So, yeah, really quick question to Seb. So you talked about the crucial importance of the advertising industry cutting its own emissions. But if you take scope 3, then your clients' emissions are your responsibility as well. So how are you addressing that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, one of the things we realised about 3 or 4 years ago was somehow the sort of the consensus around climate hadn't sort of permeated all corners of the advertising industry. And therefore, what we've been doing over the last 3 years is really introducing all companies in the industry to the concepts of scope 1, 2, and 3, greenhouse gases, you know, and the protocols, and so on and so forth. And so actually that has been an enormous part of the work. What we realized is that, you know, different agency groups were trying to define things, you know, sort of in their own way. And that meant that as a client, you could see media plan A, media plan B, 2 brands with more or less the same program, vastly different kind of estimates of the carbon footprint of that work. So we teamed up with GARM, the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, to create global media calculations to try and get to one standard set of calculations for media emissions. Media emissions are probably somewhere between half and 2/3 of the emissions of the entire advertising industry. And therefore, you know, just sorting that out. And I think we stand a very high chance by June this year of announcing the first standard global calculations on media emissions. This will be a godsend to media owners who are asking for it, because at the moment they get every single agency advertiser asking them to fill in a spreadsheet with a different version of their carbon footprint, which is no good for progress.
If I can add very quickly to that, I would say that there are 2 pieces of work that might be helpful also to check in terms of how to be responsible for scope 3 emissions. One is the concept of eco-effectiveness, which basically looks at how our advertising also increases emissions in general. And there is another work done by purpose disruptors that is called advertised emissions, and that is also a specific report and research work done to establish that question around scope 3.
Yeah, and by Side Business School that have done a piece of work sort of similarly looking at how would you calculate the carbon footprint of the impact of advertising. It's fiendishly difficult. Anyone who's been involved in trying to work out the sales impact of advertising will know that that's very, very difficult. And this is effectively a third function of the sales impact, which is the carbon impact of the sales impact. So if any of you have brilliant ideas on how to do this, definitely hang around afterwards.
Wonderful. And this is
Thank you.
By the way, it was really, really interesting to listen. I also come from advertising background.